Thanks, Charles. Yeah, I'm Holt. I work for Auburn University Extension. Joined them last year. Prior to that, I was an organic vegetable farmer for about 10 years. That was sort of my first love. So just a caveat. Um, I came into plants not through botany or ecology, like I imagine many of you did. I really came at it from more of a production side, albeit an organic production side. The longer I've gone on in it, become increasingly concerned about biodiversity loss. So I'm super sympathetic to the Wild Ones mission. I definitely think it's critical to get native plants into residential landscaping, so our ecosystems can continue to function. But normally in my job, I'm talking to commercial fruit and vegetable producers. So that's kind of my normal angle and way I think about things. But I try to combine that with ecological concerns when possible. And we're gonna go over some fruits today that can maybe fill some of that overlap. So stop me if you have a burning question or can't hear me or anything like that. This is just our standard non-discrimination statement. You can complain to the USDA if you don't like something. Okay, so I like to make people talk at the beginning. So here's my pre-quiz. Can we just name 5 edible and medicinal fruits native to North Alabama?
Oh,
Yeah.
Chickasaw plum.
You guys are too fast.
I've heard pawpaw, blueberry, Chickasaw plum, persimmon. Elderberry. I think I heard something else. Maybe blackberry. All right. Okay. Does anyone want to explain to the class what the difference between growing a plant from a seed or a cutting is, especially with tree fruit? Yes.
A seed is more genetically diverse.
Right. Yeah, cuttings, it's an exact genetic replica, which for the most part, commercial fruit is grown from grafted cuttings because it's highly variable from seed. Does anyone know if you can do pawpaw from cuttings?
So you need to.
I'm guessing you can because people graft them.
So,
They grow clonally in the wild, so I would say yes. But to get fruit, you need to have cuttings from more than one source.
yeah, I've heard several different things. You do need 2 genetically different plants to produce fruit. They do sucker clonally in the wild. You can take a cutting and graft it. It's very difficult to take a cutting and directly stick it. That's really only possible within the first few weeks of life, so it's kind of pointless at that point. So you can graft it. It's genetically identical. You can grow from seed. It'll be not genetically identical, but you can't just take a cutting and stick it right in the ground. Does anyone know if you can grow elderberry from cuttings?
Yeah.
Yeah, so elderberry is definitely, it's on the easier side to grow from cuttings. You can basically just cut off a 2-node section of it and put it right in the ground in the winter. Okay, so we just did the pre-quiz. We'll talk a little bit about wild fruit in general. We'll go through some different native fruits we have here. I'll talk a bit about blueberry and blackberry. I'm not gonna go as in depth on those because there's a ton of resources out there on blueberry and blackberry. And then I'll do more of a spotlight on elderberry, pawpaw, American persimmon, and mulberry. Okay, so why be insistent on native edibles? I think most of y'all have a sense of the ecological services of native plants, which include being host for Lepidoptera and specialty bees, and any number of other ecological functions. Some of that, obviously applies to native fruit. There is tension there in a production setting when what you might call a host plant in a ecological framework is now a pest, the same caterpillar. But, some of that is definitely compatible, especially in residential situations. For the most part, though, they're also just easier. I mean, it's a lot easier to get fruit off of a backyard blueberry plant than it is a peach. I mean, because um, they generally are more adapted here, and they're usually easier, especially if you don't want to apply a lot of inputs compared to highly bred peaches and apples. Blueberries and blackberries are definitely just easier to grow here. And then, of course, the benefits of sense of place. Cultivars up there just refers to kind of the tension I point out when, blueberries, we've been breeding them for maybe 100 years. So kind of the more you breed something for a production characteristic, you're getting farther from a wild ecotype, and you're kind of imposing more of a human hand in there, which makes it a little more complicated. And it also can create genetic bottlenecks. So the highest yielding, pawpaw cultivars, those would be the ones that you grow in a commercial setting where you're taking a cutting off of it and you're grafting it. So, maybe there's like 5 or 6 really good pawpaw cultivars. If everyone started growing them on a big scale, then you kind of creating a genetic bottleneck compared to growing things from seed, where you have a lot of variation in wild ecotypes. Blackberries today, the cultivars are way bigger than like wild blackberry. And that can, now we're selecting for yield and things like that, rather than, the ones being successful in very specific wild conditions, kind of weeding themselves out. Now we're saying, here's a plot of land, maybe this wouldn't have been blackberries, maybe this would have been a patch of sumac, and you're kind of imposing something. So that can add definitely a management layer. And then I'm sure y'all have talked about kind of the variation or sometimes decline in ecosystem services when you plant cultivars. Maybe that change the flower structure, so bees respond to that differently, and that can be less favorable than just going with straight up wild ecotypes. So these are some of the kind of the heavy hitters of native fruit. I don't think anyone's mentioned the grapes yet. I'm not going to go into grapes. I mean, I should. They're muscadine are definitely on the rise. But we're not going to go into it today. And then a couple caveats: blackberry. A lot of the commercial blackberries you get have pretty complex genetic backgrounds, including some European genetics in there. There's definitely wild strawberries. Commercial strawberries are a hybrid of or a native strawberry and a strawberry from South America. So it's kind of a definitely an asterisk there. And in terms of commercial potential, passion fruit with the native maypop. There's definitely a niche market for the flower as a herbal, a medicinal thing as far as the fruit. Nowhere close to that being a commercial fruit, but it probably could be after significant breeding work. There's kind of a list version of a ton of native fruits. So yeah, we are blessed with a ton of native fruits here. Got a couple crab apples, all kinds of plums, blackberries, dewberries. I'm even counting viburnums on here. Serviceberry, tons of grapes. Very blessed with abundant grapes. Tons of different blueberry species as well. So here's an actual picture version of those. All these, are much smaller than their domestic counterparts for the most part. A lot of these are already kind of popular, I feel like, in hunting circles. They attract a lot of wildlife. And those little crab apples, you could apple sauce those, or it would be like a labor of love to process a lot of this stuff. But I mean, it does. I mean, I think the native plums are pretty good. I mean, I don't turn my nose up on that, but I think they're harder to deal with. I think we should just admit that from like a efficiency point in the kitchen.
One question.
Yeah.
Is the extension like actively trying to breed all these different fruits, are they just selecting kind of from maybe the most promising ones, or kind of what are the activities that are happening?
Yeah, elderberry, there's definitely a lot of elderberry breeding going on right now, mostly thanks to University of Missouri and other universities kind of in the lower Midwest. Auburn's released some plums and they mess with the native genetics a little bit in those Auburn University plum releases. I don't think anyone's doing anything with the native apples. The big blackberry breeder is University of Arkansas. They release pretty much all the best commercial cultivars for the Southeast. Um, yeah, if I see more as I go, I'll mention it. Yeah, dewberries, blackberries. Chokecherry is actually one that there's a lot of breeding work done on. It's a big commercial crop in Eastern Europe where they juice it. So you could juice chokecherries and mix that with do like a juice blend with elderberry juice or maybe muscadine juice. There's a bit of a push in the upper Midwest to make aronia, usually in a crop context, maybe even this, y'all would call it aronia. Especially the black one, which is really more of a northern species. We do have it in North Alabama. The farther south you go in Alabama, the black chokecherry doesn't like it so much. Most of Alabama is the red chokecherry, and there is a naturally occurring cross of the two, which is the purple chokecherry. They have trialed those a little bit in Georgia as well. They found on the North Georgia mountains, black chokecherry did okay from a production standpoint. Once you got into the Piedmont, not so good. So as you go further south, I would switch to the red chokecherry. And the aronia, the push to make aronia a crop, which I would give credit to an organization called the Savannah Institute on that. They're kind of an agroforestry organization. They are breeding the black chokecherry aronia. Yeah, several service berries. All kinds of blackberries. So the Vaccinium corymbosum is a lot of those wild genetics were bred starting about 100 years ago into what would be called today high bush blueberry. Vaccinium virgatum, which I think is also sometimes called Vaccinium ashy. Those wild genetics have been bred into what would be called rabbit eye blueberry. So we'll talk more about blueberry, but generally around here, if you're planting a blueberry because you want to eat the blueberries, you're looking at probably a rabbit eye or maybe even a northern high bush. South Alabama, you're probably looking at a rabbit eye or a southern high bush. Yeah, wild strawberries, half of those genetics are in our commercial strawberries. Elderberries all over the place, that's definitely on the rise. We got 2 pawpaws here. I find that the small flower pawpaw is definitely kind of like under the radar. It is an edible pawpaw. You can eat them. It's just like a really small pawpaw. They get like 5, 6 foot tall would be an impressive one. I think there might be some potential. It could be kind of a dwarfing rootstock. Not sure how useful that would be. But you can definitely graft and hybridize them. In fact, they do naturally hybridize. That would be called a Piedmont pawpaw is what it's referred to actually, where the ranges overlap. And north central Alabama is definitely one of the locations where the ranges overlap. Once you get to the Tennessee line and move northward, small flower pawpaw basically goes away. Once you get down into, they only have common pawpaw. Once you get into Florida, they have like 10 or 12 other pawpaws. There's a ton of pawpaw in Florida, which spills over a little bit into the Gulf Coast, Alabama. Muscadine, obviously there's wild muscadine. There's been a lot of breeding work done on muscadine. Vitis labrusca. These grapes, the common names on grapes are hard. I mean, someone might call same thing, fox grape, frost grape. The common names confuse me at least. But the Vitis labrusca, there are also commercial cultivars of that one, including Concord. I think there's even a couple commercial cultivars of the summer grape. The rest of them, as far as I know, there aren't commercial cultivars, but decent wild fruit. Okay, any questions or comments before we get into more specifics?
Real one,
Yeah.
on the service berries, do they, I know there's like cultivars, which is one or two of them. But do they require a pollinator or something different genetics to bear fruit, or can they just do that?
I don't think I actually know the answer. Charles, do you know?
I don't know.
Or we can look that up then. I'll look that up, we'll find out.
Yeah,
Yeah, I did want to mention that's a pretty good one just from spring showy flower
It's a nice one.
landscaping plant, like filling the role of an early spring flowering
I would be
small
curious
tree.
actually purchases a native. Typically, because like,
I
think
think
there's
there's
only
a
a-
lot for us to know that too. I don't
Yeah.
know.
I think there's only a couple native to North Alabama. But, I mean, up in further north, there's quite a few more species, so similarly, yeah.
And I don't know whether, my son-in-law planted one, that's why I'm asking, you know, and I don't know if it was a cultivar or straight species, I don't recall.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
the flavor is excellent, I will say, on the service berries, but one plant you haven't mentioned yet is mayhaw. Is there a lot of work going on that one? That you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay,
Yeah. Maybe someone in South Alabama, but I'm not sure.
okay.
Yeah,
I was.
Yeah.
Is, so you mentioned Aronia not doing well in North Alabama, or as you continue further south, do you know why? Is it related to humidity or like the soil or?
I mean, if you look at the range on like a range map of the Aronia melanocarpa, I mean, it's one of those things that's like Minnesota, Iowa, like Midwest,
And then just.
North Alabama's the limit, just like you would see on ginseng or like some other like, and then it's just like the southern version of that is
Right, okay.
the red chokecherry. But much like the pawpaws, this is the place where they actually overlap and they do naturally hybridize here. Okay, so blueberries, chill hours matter for blueberries. So much like peaches, the amount of time you get, from 35 to 45 degrees in a winter, with blueberries can determine how they flower out. Also the case for peaches and apples. So if you're looking to buy, if you're only, let me back up. So blueberries are actually a pretty heavy hitter from like a shrub in terms of like caterpillars they support. So this is actually like a good one as like a keystone shrub if you wanted to plant just like a straight eco-type blueberry. If that was your goal, it's a pretty good shrub from that if your goal is to actually just produce as many caterpillars as possible. If your goal is to like grow blueberries, like a nice blueberry to eat, and you go to buy a cultivar, and there's been about 100 years of breeding work done on blueberries. You definitely want, for North Alabama, you want something between 750 and 1,100 chill hours, so that it flowers at the right time, and that's where it syncs up. So if you were like at the beach on vacation, you went to a nursery down there and you were like, oh, some blueberries, I want some blueberries, but they had plants out there that were actually 400, 500, 600 chill hours for South Alabama, that wouldn't transfer well. So that's something to look for. Another blueberry claim to fame is they like highly acidic soil. So most like domestic fruit, vegetables, 6.57 is where you want the pH. Blueberries like very acidic soil. So the easiest thing here is if you have a property that you just have acidic soil, that's kind of like the best case scenario. If you don't have that, you'll need to apply sulfur ahead of time. And the reason that matters is they're just not gonna, pH matters because plants aren't gonna take up nutrients at the level they want them if the pH is off. So even if there's plenty of iron there, If your pH is 6.5, blueberries are gonna be yellow. So, yeah, again, if your goal is ecosystem services, maybe just wild type. If you want to actually push some blueberries, I would try to raise your organic matter by applying some compost or cover crop beforehand. Definitely soil test. You definitely need to know what that pH is. Lower it if you need to. In general, with fertilizing a lot of things, the time to fertilize, if you want to get some growth out of them, is when growth already begins. If you do that while they're dormant, they're not going to take that up as well. When you plant it, cut it back about half, and remove the blooms the first year. Don't make it try to produce a fruit the first year. If you want to propagate blueberry, that usually is best taking and cutting June, July and putting it in a mist system. If you wanted to propagate them, go for the semi-hardwood cuttings. So with blueberry pruning for production purposes, you basically want to get on a schedule. So with blueberries, you've got like a central bush and there's going to be several stems growing on your bush, which is maybe 4 feet apart. You might have 7 to 10 canes ideally in the blueberry bush. Every winter you'd want to go in and take out a couple of them, a couple of the oldest canes, because eventually they just kind of senesce. You always want some new growth coming up. They're going to produce the most fruit on shoots that are maybe 2 years old. So you want to get into this rotation where every winter, if you've got 10 canes, you take out the 2 oldest and you're going to let the 2 nicest canes that came up the previous summer take those old canes place. So you just kind of get on this rotation of removing 10, 20, 30% of the canes every year. And then that's also the time to just control the size, simply for you don't want to get on a ladder to pick them. If you want to control the size that way, always remove any dead or disease. Canes, another pruning thing with blueberries. So a lot of commercial blueberry farmers hedge the blueberries in summer after harvest. Immediately after harvest, they get a sickle bar mower and they basically just cut them in half. And then they apply nitrogen fertilizer to really push that growth, because the previous year's growth, that's setting the fruit buds that are going to be the next year's crop. So they want a bunch of young growth. There's a couple of issues with that. Is you need a long season to do that. So South Alabama, it's recommended. I mean, the official Auburn horticulture line on this is don't do it in North Alabama. You don't actually have enough growing season time to push it that way. But it's pretty common in the South to do that. The other kind of issue with that is we're having a lot of fungal disease issues on blueberries. Everyone says 10, 20, 30 years ago, blueberries were the easiest thing ever. You could chuck them in the ground. They were really easy. Past 10 years, there's been a lot of fungal disease issues, kind of a thing where, a couple hypotheses I would throw out there is one, they're stressed by climate change, and these fungi are getting a leg up above the breeding. The breeding hasn't caught up to the way the fungi is benefiting from climate change in a way that the blueberries are not, would be my theory. But in any event, if you do pruning on it summer, that's opening up a wound in the plant at a time when the fungus is active and it can go in there and affect. So it's actually one strategy to try to reduce your fungal disease is to just don't do the summer pruning. I just mentioned that because if you get into blueberry pruning conversation in Alabama, summer pruning is probably gonna come up. So a lot of blueberries look like that. That's iron deficiency. But it's probably an iron deficiency because the pH is too high. So iron at low pH, it's easier for blueberries to take up iron. At a higher pH, they don't take up iron well. You could soil test and your iron levels could come out fine. But if your pH is 6 and the blueberry wants it to be 4.5, it could look like that. So you definitely want to think about that beforehand. Choose a site that's already acidic, or you're going to lower the pH by applying sulfur beforehand, because once you've already got plants in the ground, if you overdo it on the sulfur, it's gonna kind of burn them. Like, you can't put as much sulfur down after the fact. Yeah.
In terms of taproot, like how successful are they in large containers? You know? Cause you could control. it
Yeah.
pretty well with a container.
Yeah, well, I'll say, this blows my mind, but it actually is a commercial practice. I've seen this in North Carolina, where some farms bring in like literally 2 feet of straight up pine bark. And they make these huge rows of pine bark and they plant blueberries directly into the pine bark
Yeah.
rather than actually changing.
That's what I did in my last house because I didn't have good soil for it. And it was
Yeah.
okay, but it wasn't super happy, but I was just like, oh, I could have just put it in a pot. Like, I
Right.
thought, where I was like, oh, then you just put whatever soil you want.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, for those farms, that's probably a calculus that is somehow actually cheaper than for them to amend the soil with a bunch of organic matter and sulfur. But then when you go that route, you're not really getting the mineral content inherent in the soil. Now you've got basically just a substrate and you're gonna need to feed it everything it needs essentially. So if you went for just putting a blueberry in a big pot of pine bark, you would want to be more on top of giving it a complete fertilizer, because it's not going to get a bunch of mineral weathering of nutrients from straight up pine bark. So these are fungal diseases. Mummyberry, that's a fungal thing. You see Botryophyria stem blight, the kind of it almost looks like the thing that was happening with cicadas, where the end of the branch just kind of dies. It's like a flagging. And then if you cut into the stem, I know that's hard to see, but there's like brown streaks in the stem. So that's a fungal disease. Even conventional growers, I mean, there's nothing to do, like there's not chemical control for that, even if you wanted it. So basically the management for that right now just comes down to good cultural practices, which would be like mulching it to retain moisture, having good soil microbial life, irrigating it so it's not stressed through periods of drought. That would be a big one for sure. Just anything you can do to reduce stress on the plant generally and make it stronger. Yeah.
This is a newbie question by all means. We have a lot of pine straw. And you said pine bark as mulch around, would it be just good to put a better pine straw around your blueberry plants? At least we can see blueberries though.
I think yeah, pine straw would be a good mulch.
It's still mulch, right?
Yeah. Generally, in terms of actually changing the pH, you need to kind of incorporate something. The mulch, it would only act on the pH like very slowly, but I think pine straw is an excellent choice to mulch a blueberry.
I have a question about the stem blight. As far as eating the blueberries, it's still okay to eat the fruit, but fruit's not affected if it's stem blight, right? Leave that.
The fruit is affected. That'll be pretty evident, and the branch is gonna die and no longer produce fruit. And then with the mummy berry, it's gonna end up looking pretty unappetizing. Sort of not an early stage one would be a little wrinkle. Nothing bad's gonna happen to your health if you eat it, but as the disease progresses, it's gonna be obviously kind of wrinkled and not juicy. Yeah, you would know that you wouldn't want to eat it.
We actually did just have a question come in about that, and Lily Oaks was having to work with the client on it, because I didn't know.
Yeah, I wouldn't be like concerned about getting it myself or something, but you would notice if it was a bad case, it wouldn't be appetizing. Okay, so blackberries back to kind of a normal pH range with blackberries. There's blackberries are pretty prolific around here. There's several ways to propagate them. The thing that gets confusing with blackberries is there's all these different terms for kind of how vigorous they are, whether it's an erect or a semi-erect or a trailing blackberry, which basically just refers to how much it's gonna flop over when you grow it. My general recommendation is put in a trellis if you're gonna try to do blackberries for fruit. again, if you just want, you know, to have a native thorny like hedge of some kind of native shrub, then whatever. If you want to like manage it for some household fruit, I would go with a trellis like that. So the other big thing about blackberries is most of the blackberries are kind of on this 2-year cane cycle. So you plant a blackberry, it grows, it's getting ready to flower and set fruit the second year. So the 2-year-old canes is where the fruit's gonna be produced. And then the canes that are growing up that year, that's next year's fruit. And then after the blackberries are done fruiting on that second year cane, just go ahead and get them out. Just prune them out right then and there. And then now you're left with canes from the current season growth. And you go in and you can cut those off at like picking height, and that's gonna do some to kind of get bushy. And that lateral growth is gonna end up setting more fruit, so that's next year's growth. And then you kind of continue with that cycle. There are some exceptions now. University of Arkansas has a series called Primark, which means it's a primocane fruiting blackberry. So if you happen to get one of those, that's gonna grow in 1 year and that's gonna produce like a late summer blackberry. In the first year. And then the second year, that cane that produced a late summer berry your first year is going to have an early crop in its second year. And then the new growth from that year is gonna have a late crop. So you get kind of a double crop. Though, I mean, often the second crop is kind of bad because by late summer, it's so just humid and there's been so much disease and everything that they just don't really want to do it. But that's just something to know. If you ended up getting a Primark, just the normal pruning structure doesn't apply. And then the winter pruning there where it says prune laterals to 12 to 18 inches. That's just to increase fruit size. Basically to concentrate the plant's effort into a good stout stem, just like a peach grower removes 70 to 90% of the peaches on the tree because otherwise they look like a wild plum. I guess, I mean, if you thin the wild plum, it would probably get a lot bigger too. I mean, commercial fruit producers, apples, peaches, they're taking off 75, 80, 90% of the fruit, which is necessary to get a big. Like to get a big apple, you might have a cluster of apples, it's like 5 or 6 apples. They're taking off all but one apple to concentrate the resources into one big apple. That's kind of like the biggest thing I think with homeowner fruit production, where they're like, why is my fruit so small? Thinning it would be like the first recommendation I would have. So blackberry problems, a couple of them are invasive insects, Japanese beetles and spider-winged Drosophila. It's not like native blackberries are immune to all problems, though. They definitely do have some viruses and fungal disease they get. You know, and kind of the wild succession as well. Blackberries don't really last forever. You know, eventually they are going to be taken out or there's going to be other growth. So try to keep blackberries alive for 10, 20, 30 years. You know, there are some naturally occurring viruses and fungal diseases, but overall definitely much easier than an apple or a peach. Okay, we'll go a little deeper on elderberry. Elderberry is you know, it's amazing to see it in May, just flowering all over the highways, roadsides. Definitely like streams edges, but it does field edges as well, for sure. Easy to propagate through hardwood cutting. You know, you may want to identify it in the summer when it's a little easier to identify. It does have those kind of little mouse on the bark called lenticels. That's one way to identify it. It also has the leaves are directly opposite one another. So maybe it could be possible to confuse it with maybe sumac, which is alternate leaves. The leaves on an elderberry directly opposite. This is another one that I will send up, root suckers. So right now there's elderberry products everywhere. You can get elderberry at Walmart, you can get elderberry at Walgreens. Yeah, it's not like really that niche. And 99% of the elderberry, if you walk into Walmart, that's European elderberry. Even though maybe I'm being biased in what studies I'm looking at, but the studies I see say that the American elderberry is actually even a little more medicinal. American elderberry has zero of the market share right now, so that it has a lot of room for growth as a commercial crop. I mean, it's also great backyard crop if you can tolerate the kind of, a lot of people call it like a weed. Like my in-laws and neighbors, we planted elderberry there and they said, you've got a weed in your yard. Like a lot of people still call it a weed. If you can get over that, it's pretty easy one to do. Did you have something?
Maybe you'll get to it. I was wondering if you could keep it back smaller and tighter than if it.
Yeah.
It's just as well.
Yeah, in fact, for production, you should print it heavily. We'll talk about that. So that's American elderberry range there. It's all over the place. I'm not worried about, it goes way down into Florida, so we're well poised on the range there. I'll also mention there are other elderberries in the US. This is red elderberry, which is not in Alabama, but it's in the Smokies. It's not that far from here. It is in the mountains in North Carolina, Tennessee, even North Georgia. Another thing about elderberry, sometimes if you Google, can you eat elderberry raw? There's a lot of conflicting information. And that, I think the reason that is some elderberry species you really shouldn't eat raw. And this is one of them. The American elderberry, if you've got a completely ripe purple American elderberry, you can definitely juice that raw and drink it. This one you probably do need to cook. So I think a lot of sources are just kind of repeating cautious information that say don't eat raw elderberry. I mean, that's not a way people normally eat it anyway. You mostly juice it, or syrup. Syrup's probably most popular. But they all have like different degrees of the extent to which you should not consume it raw. And they've all been traditionally consumed by whatever people are indigenous to the area where the elderberry grows. So they're all definitely edible or medicinal in some form. So that's the red elderberry range. Hopefully you can see the iNaturalist distribution there. It goes into North Georgia and it's definitely at high elevations in the south. I haven't seen any evidence of it spilling over into Alabama. Blue elderberry is a West Coast one. I've heard of, it's a hedgerow thing in California to plant this blue elderberry. They haven't done any breeding on it like the American elderberry, but it seems like some people are starting to think about breeding this one as a crop for the Western US. In general, yeah, don't eat the root or the leaves, or don't eat any. You can eat elderflower. You can consume elderflower. You can consume fully ripe berries. The leaves have insecticidal properties. It's actually kind of a low grade botanical insecticide if you put the dried leaves in ethanol, maybe in water, but in ethanol, in a high proof alcohol. Same goes for pawpaw bark and pawpaw seed. Blue elderberry range, definitely Western US. This one is a non-native that does occur in kind of New England very sparsely. That's introduced one. That's another one that you shouldn't eat raw. And that one's very short. Okay, so wild elderberry, hopefully we all love it. I mean, definitely it's great for any number of small creatures that eat the berries. Decent cover for a number of animals. It does host some Lepidoptera. Kind of the focus on breeding this to be a crop revolves around getting it to set bigger heads. I mean, when you go through and harvest elderberry, if they all have small fruit heads, so it's a cluster. And you clip off the clusters. So commercially you want big clusters, so you do less clipping. literally just to save on labor cost. And also, it's better, the breeding work is also focusing on getting it to set fruit more all at once. Kind of like a determinate tomato is what they grow commercially for the most part. That sets fruit over like 3-4 weeks instead of a lot of the wild elderberries. They just kind of like flower fruit over a really long period. But again, I mean, it totally depends on your goals for your site. There's a lot of value in planting a wild ecotype. But I'll say, even with the breeding, I mean, people have only been formally breeding elderberry for 10-20 years. I mean, and most of that is actually just wild selections and maybe some F1 hybrids off of wild selections. So even like the cultivars, it's just like, there's a cultivar called Pocahontas because it was found in the town of Pocahontas, Arkansas. That's not like years of formal plant breeding like you would see on the Arkansas blackberries. That's just literally an amazing elderberry plant that somebody found in Arkansas. So it basically is a wild ecotype where it was found. And then sometimes they are doing some kind of one level crosses of those. But if you were concerned about sticking to a wild ecotype, obviously none of these are from Alabama, kind of the commercial cultivars, but there's really not been much. They're not very far from a wild ecotype. Okay, so let's get into site preparation, planting, and pruning a little bit. This is another one, definitely help. I mean, planting any fruit or vegetable for the most part. If you can prep the site beforehand, maybe get out multiple generations of weeds through either tillage or smothering it with a tarp or cardboard, or just raking it repeatedly to intentionally flush some weeds, get them out, apply some compost, plant cover crops. In general, I always recommend having living roots in the soil as much as possible to help soil microbial life. And then pH, it likes a pretty normal pH for fruit and vegetables. And if you did get a soil test for it, just go, they're not gonna have elderberry as an option to test for it. So just go off of cane fruit like you would for blackberry. They do benefit commercially from irrigation. And I mean, even commercially, a lot of way elderberry is planted is a dormant cutting gets just stuck directly in the ground. So you could start them in pots. I wouldn't even do that in a greenhouse. If you wanted a pot, just stick it in a pot, leave it outside, and it'll leaf out in the spring with those opposite leaves like that. But a lot of the larger commercial elderberry farms, which are mostly in Missouri and other parts of the lower Midwest, they just stick them right in the ground, 2 to 4 feet apart. If you got really invested as an elderberry farmer, I mean, Missouri has put out some recommendations on how much fertilizer to apply and such. Definitely not much nitrogen on the front end. What I would do is if you tested your soil and you were super low on potassium or phosphorus, you know, and you were invested in getting some nice elderberry, I'd put down a slow release source of either of those, like a rock phosphate, or maybe sunflower hull ash for potassium if you were low on that. So the first year, remove all the flowers, like you would a blueberry. So you're not gonna get much year one. So, and then as far as pruning, there's a few options. One thing that is done commercially is starting once the plant's established, like about year 3, the plants in the fall get mowed completely back down to the ground every single year. Because they will fruit on that regrowth. You could also do it every other year. That would probably work out fine. You could also prune out larger and older individual canes, pretty much like I described, like a blueberry. The reason commercially they prune it completely back down to the ground every year is because it's possible. And that's way more efficient because you can just take a sickle mower on a tractor and just do that really fast compared to like the blueberry pruning. That's a lot of hand labor. But you can, and in terms of not letting it get huge, you can be aggressive on the fall pruning, cutting it way back. A couple of issues against spotterwing Drosophila is kind of an emerging issue for the fruit, it's a fruit fly that can infest the fruit. On a home scale, if you notice that you get that, you could put a very small net over the unripe berries to just try to prevent them from getting in there. There's also several products you could try to spray on there. Japanese beetles also like it. I've listed there's any number of things to spray on Japanese beetles. The three up there I've listed would all be considered organic. As a directant is a chemical in name. Pyrethrin is from African chrysanthemum. So the thing about botanical insecticides, spray them at night. I mean, they are like pyrethrin will harm bees. So spray it at night with most botanical insecticides once the bees are done. And then the reason those products would be less harmful to pollinators is they rapidly photodegrade. So by the time the sun's coming up the next morning, a lot of botanical insecticides, they go away like really quickly. Which is why they're paying for commercial farmers, because if you're committed to using them, you have to spray them like all the time. Compared to a chemical insecticide, which is gonna have a longer residual on the plant, it's gonna last for 1, 2, 3 weeks. So you spray it way less often, and that ends up being a lot cheaper. And you get more environmental externalities by harming pollinators. So if you want a conventional insecticide, carbaryl kills Japanese beetles for sure, and other pyrethroids will as well. Pyrethroid is just when they took the idea from pyrethrin and they just started messing with the chemical until they made it way stronger. So that's the kind of chemical version of pyrethrin would pyrethroid.
Like I said, I don't grow anything worthwhile or edible, but I do grow roses, which Japanese beetles get. So you're telling me you can spray those with clay?
Yeah.
Like, I would almost like to try that just to see what happened. I didn't know that was something you could use. But does it tend to coat the leaves of the plant afterwards?
Yeah.
You need to maybe rinse that off after you get rid of the beetles. You think?
Yes, yeah. I think it will have limited effectiveness. It will do something, it'll help to some extent. And yeah, it'll definitely coat the leaves for a while. So yeah. There's also that thing, milky spore, which is a bacterial thing you can dump on the ground that's been around for about 100 years, and sometimes people think that works. I think I'm reading a lot of Japanese beetles actually already have resistance to it because it has been pretty widely used. But there are some kind of bacterial biological controls you could try as well.
I've got a question on that topic too. I mean, I don't have any grass in my yard, and most of my neighbors have like very little, and there's no Japanese beetles around. Is that because like if you don't have a lawn, they don't have the food for the grubs to survive on, or is that just like a random thing?
Yeah, I think it could be. So that's a good point. So the life cycle of Japanese beetles are most active around here late May through June, and then they produce a white grub that's in the soil late summer, fall, overwintering, and they complete the life cycle. So a lot of people they get in lawns, as you're saying. A lot of people chemically treat their lawn to kill the grub stage of the Japanese beetle. And they definitely like to munch on lawn roots. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know if they actually have a preference for that, and that's why you're not
I've seen zero Japanese.
seeing it.
Thanks, Charles.
We-
You don't show up.
But yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah, so with harvest, I mean, getting the berries off the stem is like the annoying part, right? So it can help to freeze them first. The machine you see on the right, that's like those grates are shaking back and forth. So that thing probably costs like $6,000 or $7,000 and is actually pretty small scale, but there's any number of contraptions they're trying to make that just destem the berries by basically shaking it back and forth to get the berries off. So on a home scale, you know, maybe freeze them first, and then you're looking at just, you know, bouncing them around a bucket or something, just trying to get them off, and then straining out a lot of the vegetable material. Okay, so let's get into pawpaw. It's the largest native edible tree fruit. It's got all essential amino acids. They in the 90s there was a big thing to try to get anti-cancer properties out of pawpaw. They found it was pretty hard to extract those. They also tried to get commercial insecticides out of it. There was a patent filed for that. Didn't really go anywhere though. So this is in the it's related to soursop. And there is other tropical fruits like that. I should mention that there is some concern that eating the pulp, that there are neurotoxins in there when they look looking at certain populations in Central America that consume a lot of custard apple family fruits, like a lot of it, and have curiously high rates of dementia. So something I think is worth mentioning. So I wouldn't need a pint of pawpaw ice cream every single night of my life. I think it's probably safe to eat pawpaw August, September, moderate amounts. But yeah, I think it's worth mentioning that there is some concern that eating a lot of pawpaw has some it's a neurotoxin. It's also a toxin for a lot of insects. Deer won't eat the leaves. Goats don't browse it once they get a taste for it. You know, it's a host for zebra swallowtail butterfly, but kind of the flip side of all that is there are a few pests, but a lot of things won't eat it. And those toxins are way more concentrated in the bark and the leaves than they are in the fruit. So there's a range. It goes into North Florida. It definitely doesn't go all the way down in Florida. They have a ton of other pawpaws though. Small flower pawpaw, usually on drier sites, maybe 4 or 5 feet tall. You can eat it. It's just like a really small pawpaw. This is definitely a deep south plant. The small flower pawpaw is. We mentioned the clonal colonies. So sometimes if you see like a bunch of pawpaws and there's no fruit on it near a stream bank or something, if it could just be one clone essentially. It's one grove with all the same genetics. So that can happen where it's isolated from other genetics and it's just not going to set fruit. It's pollinated by flies and beetles. So you do need a couple of different genetics. So if you grow it from seed, you're going to be fine. If you buy cultivars, get at least 2 cultivars. So if you want it, so why grow a cultivar? It's bigger fruit. You're going to have higher yields. They've been selected a little bit for taste. When you grow it for seed, it's just you don't really know what you're going to get. So commercially, there are some cultivars. This is maybe in the last 40 years that they've really been breeding. There's basically 2 major breeders. One is Neil Peterson, who's an agricultural economist who just got really into pawpaw and took it upon himself to just breed, like devote his life to breeding pawpaws. All his stuff is named after rivers in Virginia, West Virginia, so that's how you know that's his stuff. And then Kentucky State University is also, they do pawpaw research and breeding. Alabama A&M did look at some pawpaws about 20 years ago. They found sunflower and 421 did well for them. There's also a gentleman, Dale Brooks, who lives in Morgan County, who he had a couple acres of pawpaw. He's probably the biggest pawpaw grower in Alabama history. He told me he likes sunflower as well. All his pawpaws died from Phytophthora root rot after being like bomb proof for 20 years. So that was interesting to me. So if you get a seed, they need a moist stratification. Maybe 3 months in the fridge, slightly moist sand, put them in a pot outside, be patient. It can take them like 2 months to come up. So if you stratify it in the fridge over winter, a seed, and then you plant it in a pot in the spring, don't give up on it. If it's not up in a month, it can take 2 or 3 months. Pawpaw, it's kind of hard to buy pawpaw cultivars. There's way more demand for it than there is suppliers right now who are licensed to propagate these cultivars. So I mean, if you try to buy like a Susquehanna or one of the Peterson cultivars, I mean, they can be sometimes like $200 because there's so many more people that want them right now than there are nurseries propagating them. This is actually one of the few plants that it's recommended to actually plant from a container instead of a bare root plant. It's like one of the only fruit trees that that's a recommendation rather than putting out a bare root plant, because the roots are pretty sensitive. And put shade cloth on it the first year. So it's an understory plant naturally. It does produce better in full sun. If it could tolerate partial shade its whole life, you wouldn't get as much fruit, but you could definitely do that if that fit with your design. But if you plant it in full sun, that's a tomato cage with probably 30% shade cloth. You just need some system the first year after planting to give it a little bit of shade. It does respond to fertility in a commercial sense. So those are the flowers there. Pawpaw flowers, they kind of change. So there's one flower, it emerges as female flower with a receptive stigma in an ovary, and then it starts producing pollen. So that's the one on the left is producing pollen. So that one actually used to look like the one on the right. So the same flower actually does both, within the same tree. So that's kind of a unique thing about pawpaw. Printing to the central leader system. Chilling hours doesn't matter for pawpaw, by the way. The more light penetration you could get for any tree fruit, meaning, you should print it so it's not so dense that you want to get light into the interior. That's going to give you better photosynthesis to actually produce fruit. So Japanese beetles will get on it, and then several caterpillars, which you could say it's a host plant, and it is. When you're growing it in a production sense, that's now a caterpillar pest, essentially. And so some of those are native. Usually August into early September up here, you're looking at harvest. Don't eat unripe pawpaw. Definitely can upset the stomach. Unripe pawpaw, don't eat the seeds, don't eat the skin, eat fully ripe pawpaw fruit only. Do store it in the refrigerator. All right, a couple more here. American persimmon. Does anyone have persimmon? Yeah, so this is good one, a little over the radar. I mean, this is a big tree. The thing to know here is if you grow it from seed, it could end up being a male persimmon or a female persimmon. So it's dioecious, meaning some individuals have flowers producing pollen. Some individual trees have only flowers that have an ovary that's going to end up producing fruit. So if you grow it from seed, it would be possible you would only get males and not get any fruits. So there's the range. So it's southern into the lower Midwest. Persimmon, it's pretty regional, and then there's this curious phenomenon where some persimmons have 60 chromosomes, some persimmons have 90 chromosomes. And the 90 chromosome persimmons are bigger. They're a better fruit, honestly. And the areas where they occur have a persimmon culture. There's like some overlap between that. Like southern Indiana, big persimmon pudding area, and central North Carolina also has 90 chromosome persimmons, which is a little baffling because otherwise they're mostly northern species, and there's also a persimmon culture there. So I'm not sure whether that was not sure exactly how that happened, but we'll get into that a little bit. So they're also, hunters like them because a lot wildlife eat them. They do support some Lepidoptera. Um, they're fire resistant. There's accounts, early kind of written accounts, 1700s, indigenous people burning big fields of essentially persimmon and honey locust savannas. So you can manage them from that perspective. Pretty similar to pawpaw, do a 3-month moist stratification. They're pretty easy to germinate, like in a tree pot and plant them out, or you could do some kind of bed where you dig it up and put it out the next winter. If you're going for like a wild ecotype persimmon, and if you don't mind that half of them could be males. Otherwise, you can do it from cutting, you can graft if you want to get either a cultivar or a female. So there are actually cultivars. So a lot of like the big persimmons are Asian persimmons, right? And there are some cultivars of American persimmon, much like the Asian persimmons, which have been bred for hundreds of years. The American persimmons, the breeding qualities they're looking for are bigger fruit and loss of astringency. We probably all know you don't want to eat a persimmon until it's extremely ripe, like looking like it's way overripe. Otherwise, it's super astringent, it's terrible. Most of the cultivars are northern in origin because they're the 90 chromosome. When you grow those here, they end up being seedless if they're pollinated by 60 chromosome persimmons. So, you know, that's a northern cultivar and ends up being like a huge, juicy persimmon with no seeds. Those are some other names that Clemson recommends. Those are all native up there. Again, all these northern ones, 90 chromosome, northern origin American persimmons. Some persimmons actually do have male and female flowers and will self-pollinate. Actually, that's an asterisk I should have mentioned. And those happen to mostly be the northern origin 90 chromosome persimmons. You know, a lot of time they get spots on the leaves, spots on the fruit. Some of that, it's okay. You can just kind of deal with it. They're pretty prone to bagworms, webworms. I mean, that's not a huge deal. I would just, if your goal is to grow caterpillars, don't do anything. If you want them to stop their life cycle to get more fruit, just cut it off and burn it. And you can get these twig girdlers that end up snapping twigs. Freezing it can help remove the astringency. I mean, most people pulp them, like you could get like a fruit pulper, little home scale fruit pulper, and for the most part, when I've seen them sold, it's as a American persimmon sold, it's as a frozen pulped persimmon for people to make pudding or other baked goods. All right, so here's our final one, and it's the most confusing. Does anyone have a mulberry at their house? Okay. Does everyone have what they think is just a native red mulberry? Or does anyone have a cultivar? So yeah, red mulberry, it's native much of the eastern US, all through Alabama. You know, it's a pretty good sized tree, can live for a long time. The confusing thing about this is we've also got the white mulberry here, which is the silkworm mulberry. One of the first domesticated crops of all time anywhere was the white mulberry in China. Because the silkworm caterpillars eat those. The leaves are super high in protein on all mulberries, so they're actually pretty good like tree hay or fodder. The white mulberry is listed as invasive in a lot of states, definitely spreads here. It's all over the place. That's the silkworm mulberry. You also have the black mulberry, Morus nigra. That's kind of a South Asian mulberry, which is generally regarded as the highest eating quality. And then you've got the invasive paper mulberry, which is in a different genus, but looks pretty similar. Okay, so there's red mulberry range. Okay, so there's a lot of debate the extent to which there's pure red mulberry anywhere in the eastern US at all. I think we're likely to have a lot more pure red mulberry here in Alabama, like than in Virginia or other areas of the US where they intentionally introduced white mulberries in the 1600s and then again tried several times, like every 50 years, to get a silk industry going in North Carolina and Virginia. They brought in a lot of white mulberry and it hybridized with red mulberry a lot. I took that in my yard. That has characteristics that appear to be a red mulberry, but I'm not confident telling you there's no white mulberry genetics in that. Because there's also white mulberry all over my yard, and they do hybridize. How much does that really matter if you got something that's appearing to be a red mulberry and has some white genetics in terms of its ecosystem functioning? I don't know. So the white are glossy. They're shiny. They're glossy. Paper mulberry has hairy stems and even some hairy twigs. And then there's also hybrids. So a lot of the cultivars that are sold for fruit production are hybrids of the native red mulberry and the white mulberry. And the color doesn't correspond. The color of the fruit doesn't necessarily correspond to the common name either. So Illinois everbearing is like one of the most common mulberries grown for fruit production. And sometimes you'll see it listed as a Morus rubra, but it's definitely not. It's definitely a hybrid. So because sometimes nurseries just don't know because it actually is incredibly complex and you could spend your life agonizing over whether something is pure red mulberry or has white genetics in it. And also some states it's actually restricted to sell white mulberry because it's invasive. So a lot of times a nursery is going to call it a Morus rubra even though it might have other genetics in it. Okay, so but just to tell them apart, that's the one that I think looks like a red. The other two look like a white. To me, red mulberry, it's like a dinosaur leaf. It's very dull. You could probably stick it on your shirt and it would stay there. It's velvety, scratchy, dull, dinosaur skin, prominent veins, pointy tip. White mulberry is shiny, smooth to the touch. Maybe more rounded serrations and usually smaller. If you got a big mulberry leaf, that's gonna look more like, you should be thinking red mulberry. So one on the left, white, that looks more like a white, that looks more like a red to me. But there's definitely a lot of hybridization and it gets complicated, and the leaf shape, when a mature red mulberry like has like the heart shape. I should also say basswood kind of looks like that, but it's more, it's not gonna be perfectly cylindrical, or symmetrical. But that red mulberry when it was young probably looked like the picture all the way on the left. Like they come out looking lobes all over the place. So don't get tripped up by the lobes because when they're young, the lobes are gonna do whatever they want. That's not the best indicator. So these are a bunch of mulberries sold as cultivars for people to grow mulberries. A lot of them are crosses. A lot of those ones listed as rubra would be really hard to find. Are they actually pure rubra? It's hard to tell. I don't really know. That's just the best research I could do on those. The everbearing, if it's listed as everbearing, the benefit of that is it's gonna fruit over a really long period. Like the Hicks everbearing fruits for like 4 months, whereas if you've got a pure rubra or even a pure alba, the fruiting window is much smaller. That's the main benefit of if growing a hybrid. Some of the hybrids will produce a viable seed, some of them won't. If you thought you had a pure rubra seed and you want to grow it based off the seed and the fruit, you could soak it in some water and then blend it like with one of those mortar mixers on a drill or something like that. And then kind of strain that off, get the seeds out and plant it. It will come up from seed. You can also take cuttings. June cuttings kind of work best with the mist system. You can also graft it.
So if you have a red mulberry, like I have one that's really, really old, I don't know, it's huge. But I mean, there's no seedlings, I look everywhere and I think it didn't come up all around, it's by my creek.
Yeah.
Could I do that then?
Yeah, and the fact that it's not spreading makes me think that it's more likely to actually be a pure
I'm
red mulberry.
40 years, but it's, I mean, I can't tell you how big, it's huge.
Yeah. Yeah, you could try, if you get some fruit off of it with seeds, you could try it from seed. By blending up the fruit and then straining off the pulp a few times and then getting those seeds out of there. And then you could plant those immediately, or you could store them over the winter.
Okay, so if anybody wants to try, I'm trying to find to have some different ones, but we looked, I remember we looked up there for that, I showed.
The big thing you see in the South is this fungal disease called popcorn disease, which hits the white mulberry and hybrids actually more than it hits the red mulberry. But you can see in the picture on the left, that's like a normal mulberry compared to a mulberry that the fruit has been colonized by. There's a fungal mass in there, so that's like hard as a rock. So that once you get that, your tree is pretty much ruined. And there's really nothing to do about it.
Got one other question about red versus white. The fruit, isn't it generally much longer for the red mulberry? The white mulberry is like a little tiny kind of nub.
Yeah, it can be. And the longest fruit at all is probably the Morris nigra, the black mulberry, South Indian, which doesn't do well here because it doesn't really tolerate humidity. So sometimes you will also see something called a nursery or selling something as Morris nigra. That's almost definitely a Morris alba. The names get really mixed up. It's a huge headache and there's a lot of debate about it. Yeah, it's a nightmare.
That's a good point.
So in the US, we're really overlooking mulberry. There's very little mulberry research here. Other areas in the world do a lot more with mulberries. So I mean, one of the annoying things about mulberry is like a big tree. So you can't really pick the fruit. You're either letting it, you can put a tarp down and collect the fruit off the tarp. Otherwise, you're just kind of taking your chances of picking it up before other animals get it. And in a commercial sense, usually like the food safety regulations don't like fruit dropping to the ground. So one of the issues is like, it's like a little berry. It's like a lot of labor to pick it. But it's also really high. So I think that's one of the reasons it's not like a commercial fruit so much. But you could manage it like that. And in Asia, they do. So that's called pollarding. This is way more common in Europe and Asia than it is here. But in that system, you grow your mulberry, you cut it off, maybe above the browse line, if you don't want deer to eat the foliage. And then mulberry will produce on first year growth and also on second year growth. But I would get into a 2-year rotation where you grow the mulberry, you cut it off in the winter, the next year it's gonna sprout. You'll get some fruit from that, leave all of that, or maybe anything crossing or super crowded, take it out, but leave a lot of that growth. And then you're gonna get more growth the second year. And then basically you want 2 different age groups of wood at a time. So you'd be taking out 3-year-old wood and you're letting new wood come up every year. If you wanted to get into a system like that to handpick it or just make it more manageable and that will stimulate some pruning as well, the pruning action. All right, so that's all I got for you. I know that was pretty long, but for more native fruits, I'm gonna plug a couple events. Jeremy Love from Kentucky State is gonna be at an event I'm organizing Saturday, November 2nd. He knows way more about pawpaw than me. That'll be a great talk. Also, Angie Koma, who works for Intertribal Agriculture Council and has her own farm. She's gonna be talking about the native fruit she's planted in South Alabama. Also some mushroom talks, other things that might be of interest to y'all. If you want to go to Birmingham on November 2nd. That's gonna be, it's mostly like an organic fruit and vegetable conference, but definitely with an ecological slant. And then I'm also doing basically that, but shorter, condensed, maybe change it a little bit. And then Jesse from Feral Foraging is gonna talk about basically the same fruit, but how to forage them. This event is sponsored by Wild Ones, thank you. And it's also technically sold out. I capped it at 40 people and we've registered, but if you wanna go, let me know, cause you can go, cause It's one of those things where you don't make people pay for something and they register and then a lot of people don't show up because they didn't pay for it. So you can let me know if you want to go. You can still go because I doubt everyone who registered shows up. You can also, email me if you want more resources on any of this. Happy to send you anything. And yeah, if you want to fill out our survey, you could do that as well. But yeah, and thank you for having me, and happy to answer any questions or talk to me afterwards.
I had a question about plums. There's like a Mexican, an American. Have you considered managing this? I don't know.
Yeah. I definitely like the American plums. And those are kind of like a small tree. You can get that as like a single stem plum where it's a small tree. The Chickasaw plum is gonna be more of like a hedge type of deal, but yeah, I like the taste of the native plums for sure.
Thank you.